Today we are going to be talking about The Death of the Moth, which is the end of our Virginia Woolf, of which we have had a lot. So I don't think this is going to be a super long lecture, but we'll see. So The Death of the Moth is an essay, so meaning it's nonfiction. She really did sit down and watch this moth die in a window pane. And I mean, I really like this essay because I think the symbolism of the moth is pretty clear. And I think by using such clear symbolism throughout the essay, Woolf is able to kind of leave the reader space to ponder mortality itself, which I think is cool. So the essay opens with the phrase, or with the sentence, "Moths that fly by day are not properly to be called moths. They do not excite that pleasant sense of dark autumn nights and ivy blossom, which the commonest yellow underwing asleep in the shadow of the curtain never fails to rouse in us." So there's this sense immediately that this moth isn't even it's not fulfilling its destiny as a moth. It's not a butterfly, but it's a day moth, and she sees it as kind of like a very low existence. She calls it a so mean an antagonist. Mean meaning tiny and small and unimportant. She says that of it at the end, but there's a lot in this story to kind of show you how insignificant and small Woolf is seeing this moth as. Even among moths, this moth ain't much, So, despite this moth's inability to live up to the ideal of mothness, it seems to be enjoying itself, right? So she says, "Nevertheless, the present specimen, with his narrow hay-colored wings fringed with a tassel of the same color, seemed to be content with life." And then she gives us this imagery of what the day is like. So she very clearly sets up this really beautiful backdrop for us, against which a tragedy will happen, as we know from the title. So it seems to be a beautiful late summer morning. There's all this natural sort of beauty, and she's kind of giving us this sense of the two driving forces of existence, and she expands it beyond human existence because we have the crows and the horses, as well as I think there's a farmer in here. Maybe I just imagined the farmer. Where's the farmer? The horses. I guess there has to be someone to plow, but humans are not really explicitly mentioned in this story. So she's setting up these two important forces of all of existence, and those are life and death, right? So the summer day is symbolic of life because we have these plows, we have the earth that gleamed with moisture. Such vigor came rolling in from the fields and down beyond that it was difficult to keep the eyes strictly turned upon the book. So there's this real clear sense that the world outdoors is alive. It's infused with the energy of living. And then she gives us this image of the crows, which I think is important. So the rooks, too, were keeping one of their annual festivities, soaring round the treetops until it looked as if a vast net with thousands of black knots in it had been cast up into the air, which after a few moments sank slowly down upon the trees until every twig seemed to have a knot at the end of it. Then suddenly the net would be thrown into the air again in a wider circle this time, with the utmost clamor and vociferation, as though to be thrown into the air and settle slowly down upon the treetops were a tremendously exciting experience. So she spends a lot of time on these crows, which means that we should consider what they mean. And I think she's writing about these crows because crows are generally symbolic of something more akin to death than life, right? Like they're dark, they're I don't know, they're kind of ominous. Like I don't know exactly why crows have this symbolism, but I mean, I feel like in most literature and media, crows are not necessarily like a good sign. You know, it's not kind of the opposite of like a dove or something. So the crows are both a symbol of death and also are filled with life here because they keep like flying up in the trees and then landing again. So it's kind of that marriage of like the force of life and the force of death in the crows. And then she says the same energy that is like inspiring everything else going on in this day is also the energy which, quote, sent the moth fluttering from side to side of his square of the window pane. So Woolf is kind of showing us this huge like life force outside of her window, and then she is looking to this tiny moth, and she is sort of feeling a sense of, I think, wonder at the fact that the moth is animated by this same life force somehow, right? Like the same force that gives us like the farms and the fields and summer and our own existence. That's the same thing that keeps this moth flying around in the window pane, even though you know, it's a much smaller existence for this moth. And she continually returns to the moth's smallness, right? Like she says she feels pity for him. He can't really do that much. He's just stuck in his window pane. There's sort of this sense of like the futility of the moth's existence, right? So he has like all this energy, all of this life force, but he can only apply it within this tiny little space. He's really like boxed in by his circumstances. She says he was little or nothing but life, which I think is kind of cool, right? Like we think of life as this huge force, but the moth too is life itself. And then she says that even though you know, she feels pity for him and she sees that what he's doing is kind of futile, she also says, at the bottom of page 248, there was something marvelous as well as pathetic about him. It was as if someone had taken a tiny bead of pure life and, decking it as lightly as possible with down and feathers, had set it dancing and zigzagging to show us the true nature of life. Thus displayed, one could not get over the strangeness of it. One is apt to forget all about life, seeing it humped and bossed and garnished and cumbered so that it has to move with the greatest circumspection and dignity. Again, the thought of all that life might have been had he been born in any other shape caused one to view his simple activities with a kind of pity. So I think that's kind of the most important part in this story, because first of all, I love that she talks about this tiny bead of pure life. Like I think Woolf has a really, she's really good at like taking like the abstract concept of existence and being itself and giving it these like images that are concrete. So like a tiny bead of pure life, or if you think back to Slater's pins have no points, at the end when Fanny is describing Julia, there's like this fountain of pure being that she sees like radiating from her. So I think that's like a really cool thing that Virginia Woolf is really good at. And so this moth is a tiny bead of pure life, showing us the true nature of life. And right now Woolf is using words to describe the moth's movement, like dancing and zigzagging. So dancing in particular has a celebratory connotation to it. When we imagine someone dancing, we don't really think of them as being like on the brink of death. So I think that Woolf is kind of showing too that she didn't realize this moth was about to die when she was like watching it in the window pane, flying around, flapping around. And so if this moth shows us the true nature of life, I think we have to obviously ponder the question then that, like, what is the true nature of life if it is represented in this moth? And I mean, it's kind of, I think the answer is maybe, I don't know, kind of depressing. Maybe I'm just reading it that way. Like, I'll put it in the discussion forum to see what you guys think. Like, you know, what's the meaning of life? Just let me know what you think. But, you know, the futility and the smallness of this moth, I think, are something that she's really, like, hammering home to kind of show that, you know, on the one hand, there's, like, this beautiful animating life force that we all share, but on the other hand, like, the moth is stuck in a window pane. And then she says she thinks of all that life might have been had he been born in any other shape. The moth is reined in by circumstance, and this kind of reminds me of a lot of what Woolf said too in, like, A Room of One's Own, about how, like, if you're born into poverty or, like, you don't have access to education, you're probably going to have a hard time reaching the genius of Shakespeare, right? Like, Woolf was always very, very conscious of how one's circumstances informed what one was able to do in the world. So even down to this moth, right? Like, he's stuck in a window pane, so all he can do is fly around in there. Okay. So after a time, he stops, and then she kind of stops paying attention to him, the moth, and then he starts flapping around again. She says he was trying to resume his dancing, so she's still using this word with, like, a celebratory connotation, but at this point the moth can't do it anymore. And she says, I watched these futile attempts for a time without thinking, unconsciously waiting for him to resume his flight, as one waits for a machine that has stopped momentarily to start again without considering the reason of its failure. And so this is a really interesting moment too, I think, because seeing the moth as a machine is, I guess, like, fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of life, right? Like, we are not machines. We are, like, vulnerable to death, you know? And I think that at this moment, she kind of realizes that her expectations, her unconscious expectations for the moth, are not likely to come true, right? Because the moth isn't a machine. The moth seems to have spent its life energy, and now, like, there isn't much left for it. The moth becomes helpless. He could no longer raise himself. His legs struggled vainly. And she finally says, it came over me that the failure and awkwardness were the approach of death. And she laid her pencil down. So I think this is also, like, a bit of a metaphor too, right? Because she's sitting at her writing desk, so that would be what she had as a pencil. But I think that there's also sort of, like, a metaphor here, that, like, the pencil, it's the instrument of writing, and she can't save the moth with her pencil. And I think that she might be saying something here too about, like, can writing save us? Like, is that something that can stave off death? And it's not. Like, nothing can stave off death. So I think that's sort of what she's saying there too. She says, I looked as if for the enemy against which he struggled. I looked out of doors. I'm in the middle of 249 now. What had happened there? Presumably it was midday and work in the fields had stopped. Stillness and quiet had replaced the previous animation. The birds had taken themselves off to feed in the brooks. The horses stood still. Yet the power was there all the same, massed outside, indifferent, impersonal, not attending to anything in particular. Somehow it was opposed to the little hay-colored moth. So this is interesting, right? Like, the whole story, she's kind of been saying that the moth is really, like, small and insignificant, but now that the moth is dying, we see that the earth itself is almost feels like it's pausing to like give the moth this moment of its own death. So the plight of the moth is like reflected in the whole world because it's midday and because all of this like animated stuff has stopped. Everyone is taking a break and the moth is dying. And I love how she talks about this power. So I think I'll put that in the discussion too, which you can go into that. Sorry. Okay. So the world has stopped, almost as if to reflect the moth's death, make space for the moth's death. And she watches him die, and she knows she can't do anything, right? One could only watch the extraordinary efforts made by those tiny legs against an oncoming doom which could, had it chosen, have submerged an entire city, not merely a city, but masses of human beings. Nothing, I knew, had any chance against death. So, just as earlier in the story, the life force that was outdoors animating the entire world, just as that life force was also like distilled to like this powerful point within the moth, now the force of death is also like fully embodied by the moth. And I think this is cool because she's kind of like erasing the, like normally when we see a moth die, I think for most people, we don't think like, oh my god, like I am also so vulnerable to death. Usually we think like, I don't know, like glad I'm not a moth, because if I was a moth, I could die just because the dust came off my wings or something, you know, like, but Woolf really sees this moth's death as like emblematic of all of our deaths. So the force that kills the moth is the same force that will come for all of us eventually, and also the same force that she says has the power to like, you know, submerge cities, masses of human beings. So nothing has any chance against death. The death of this moth is no different than any other death. It's smaller, but it's the same force that's come for this moth. She says, one's sympathies, of course, were all on the side of life, so she's like rooting for the moth, which makes sense because she is alive and, you know, right, like all living beings are biased toward life. Also, when there was nobody to care or to know this gigantic effort on the part of an insignificant little moth against a power of such magnitude to retain what no one else valued or desired to keep, moved one strangely. Again, somehow one saw life, a pure bead. So even in the moth's struggle against death, and perhaps most of all in the moth's struggle against death, Woolf is seeing like the force of life, the force of like the desire to live. She says, I lifted the pencil again, useless though I knew it would be. And that's, again, like this, she did eventually lift the pencil to write this essay about the moth, so maybe it wasn't useless, right? But unfortunately, the moth has died. The struggle was over. The insignificant little creature now knew death. As I looked at the dead moth, this minute wayside triumph of so great a force over so mean an antagonist filled me with wonder. Just as life had been strange just a few minutes before, so death was now as strange. The moth, having righted himself, now lay most decently and uncomplainingly composed. Oh yes, he seemed to say, death is stronger than I am. So, in the end, of course, death triumphs over the moth. And so I think there's sort of an allegory here, right, about like what it means to be alive, right? Like, you can, maybe your existence is futile, like, which, you know, in some ways for all of us, no matter what we do, we're still very small in, like, the universal scale of things. Most individual lives aren't going to matter on, like, a galactic level, right? But still, we can, you know, we can find our contentment, just as this moth did. And in the end, death is stronger than all of us. And also, we're all kind of hemmed in by our circumstances. Like, you know, what you can do with your life is, in many ways, decided by, like, what, you know, circumstances you were born into. So even the fact, the circumstance of being born as a human, right? Like, that defines how we live our lives and defines the fact that we're even aware of mortality at all. So maybe we should talk about what an allegory is. Just occurred to me we might not have gone over that in class yet. Let me see, I want to get you guys like a good definition, but the internet's really slow right now, so let's see. Okay, well, I also can just kind of explain it. So like an allegory is a story which also has like another layer of a hidden meaning under it. So in an allegory, everything within the story corresponds to something else, some other event. So if you've ever like read Animal Farm, that's a really classic allegory in which it's about a farm, but it's actually about Soviet Russia, and all the pigs are symbolic of different people in the Russian government. This isn't that direct of an allegory. This allegory has more of like a moral lesson about, I don't know, like the meaning of life, the meaning of mortality. So I'll put that definition up on Moodle. Sorry, I'm bad at definitions on the fly. Maybe I can do it on my phone actually. That way. I don't know where my phone is. Okay, whatever. I'll put it on Moodle. Make a note of that. Okay. So I guess I'll also like address the exam. We had a faculty meeting this morning that was kind of like about how to go forward with things. I think a lot of us are sort of unhappy with how much we're all still being expected to do as the world like literally ends around us, and not us so much as like what students are being asked to do. So I have been kind of trying to figure out like how to have an exam that would be fair, but I think I'm just honestly going to do it the same way as I've done the other exams. So you'll just take it at home, and I guess you can Google stuff. It'll be open book, like I don't think that's a problem, and I think, everyone deserves a break right now, so you should all be able to do really well on the exam. And for the final PLP, I guess I'll like solicit some input, but like I'd probably be okay with getting rid of that. Just, if you guys wanted to do that. So I might make like a poll of some sort to see if you still want to do that, because I know a lot of you guys like still have to work. A lot of people are just dealing with a lot of stuff right now. So I'd be fine not doing the final PLP. I definitely think you guys are generally doing better on the exams than on the PLPs, so it would probably help most of your grade anyway. And just generally with grading, I mean, I don't really want anyone to fail this class this semester. Like, you guys have all been really, for the most part, like those of you who were coming to class before the semester went online, like, you're all doing the work, you're doing a good job. So yeah, so the exams will be stuff you can just, it'll be identify and explain, and like defining terms. I might do multiple choice actually to make it easier for all of us. And yeah, they'll be open book. everything's open book. I can't watch you take the exam. So, all right. So think about whether or not you want to do the final PLP. If you do not do it, like if we don't do it as a class, your exam grades will just be weighted more heavily. All right. And I guess the other 2 PLPs will be weighted a little more heavily too. So, yeah, we'll see. Okay, that's all I got for you today. I'll put some discussion questions up on Moodle. I hope you guys are all doing well, staying safe, taking care of yourselves, and I will talk to you next week.